I know you were instrumental in bringing about a ceasefire in Georgia. How badly does this country need a ceasefire right now?
But it's one of these moments when, idealism meets realism. I just don't see that ceasefire coming. And the reasons are very simple. I think the stakes for Vladimir Putin are too high. In Georgia, it was fairly easy to do that in 5 days. But I think in Ukraine, he's looking for a big war and a big peace. And to be honest, if I was President Zelensky, there would be very little that you can compromise on at the moment.
Do you think, actually, the world has already caused so much harm to President Putin, he feels like he's got nothing to lose? Is that why he's after a big war, as you put it?
Well, I think, he has a stated aim, and that is historical Great Russia, which for him includes Belarus and Ukraine. So that's his sort of vision. He wants to create his own legacy. He wants to be there with the Stalins and the Ivan the Terribles and Peter the Greats of Russia as a great leader. And I don't think he will do anything that stands in his way to stop it. And the problem, of course, is that he can't lose face, and he knows that. So therefore, we're into the 4th week in this war, and he's not looking extremely good and probably getting increasingly desperate as well.
So what are his options now? What will his end game look like?
It's very difficult to say. I think there are 3 options in this conflict, as there quite often are. One is the withdrawal of Russian troops. Obviously, he's not looking for that. The other one is to split Ukraine into 2, Eastern and West Ukraine. The Ukrainians will never allow that to happen. And thirdly is that he goes all the way and tries to take over Ukraine. So I think all of the options, the first one is the one that I'd love to see, but the 2 other ones are quite horrific, to be honest. But, as I said earlier, I think this is going to be a protracted long-term conflict. So we're not talking only about weeks, but most probably months.
Well, it is already horrific, as you know. So how do you hold on to a nation when they begin to hate you?
For Putin, obviously you have a couple of things there. You have to remember that in the DNA of Russian culture and history is this sentiment that the rest of the world is against Russia, and Russia is isolated and surrounded, attacked from the east by the Mongols in the olden days, and now formerly by the Nazis, and now by the Westerners. So there is this sort of psyche that, what's going on is we have to fight for Russia and Russian identity. But of course, it's going to be a combination of things. So one is the sanctions, a country that is moving towards a potential default. The other one is the fact that Ukraine might be able to push back. But in Russia, what you need is basically a bottom-up movement to get rid of any leader that you have. And I think this has to come from the inside. We can't force change.
Well, what about that idea of pushing back then? How do you see the Ukrainians fighting this, and how do you reckon they've gone so far? And how does it compare with what Finland did back in 1939?
Yeah, there are some elements, obviously, of the Winter War. 1939 lasted for 101 days. And there's this sort of sentiment, almost of heroic nostalgia when we're watching the Ukrainians fighting. And the parallels are there and are not. The parallels that are is that when you're attacked by a big aggressor, for us it was the Soviet Union, for Ukraine, it's Russia, your sort of sentiment of defending and protecting your country goes beyond the call of duty, so to speak. Whereas the attacker, in other words, the Russian soldiers, some of them are wondering, what are we actually doing here? Why are we doing this? The second one is that they are now being fed with arms, with financial aid, with humanitarian aid. And the longer this goes on, the more convinced I am that actually Ukraine and President Zelensky can push back. And in that sense, things are not looking very good for Putin. This is only an educated guess. I'm not a military expert.
Well, they can push back. Are you actually suggesting you think the Ukrainians can win this?
Well, again, this is where idealism meets realism, and I can't give you an answer on that. But I would argue that if you're looking at victory over the hearts, minds, and souls of the rest of the world, the Ukrainians have already done that. And if you're looking at defeat in terms of showing the weakness of your military, then Putin has already done that. So in that sense, I would argue that the Ukrainians have already won. But then the final issue here is the end state. You know, are they going to be able to maintain the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and its territory? That's going to be the key.
We were just seeing a piece there from Ireland questioning their own neutrality. You know, where does Finland stand on this, on NATO neutrality and all those questions that have been prompted by this war?
Well, I certainly wouldn't compare Finnish and Irish neutrality, because ours during the Cold War was one of necessity, with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. When the Cold War ended, we immediately ditched the notion of neutrality, joined the European Union, joined the Euro, a very close partnership with NATO, participate in NATO operations and also in NATO training. Our military is more NATO compatible than that of many member states. And we were very quick to send arms to Ukraine as well. But this has obviously shifted public opinion on NATO membership. You know, we used to be 50 against 24. Now, the latest opinion poll is 62% in favor of NATO membership and 16 against. So if I may predict with my academic glasses on, the train has left the station and eventually Finland will join NATO.
Very interesting. So many implications from this conflict, certainly. Professor Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, thank you very much indeed for your time. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.